So last week I talked about options for greenhouse gas emission reduction. Now we went through the chi identity, and the first element of the chi identity is of course population growth. So I think it was the day after, Professor McCormack of Anglia Ruskin University released a book arguing that climate change is so severe that the only solution is the extinction of humankind. So there's no more humans, there will be no more fossil fuel burning, and therefore climate change will go away. There's absolutely no arguing with the logic there. But it is perhaps a radical solution. It would be a nice exam question to comment on this proposal in the light of the scenario exercises that we did last week. Right? So today I'm going to talk about the cost of emission reduction rather than the technical options. I'm going to touch on four subjects. I'm going to talk about the absolute estimates, the size of these things. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty about these things, so I'm going to talk about the sensitivity of these cost estimates. New elements for this year is that I'm going to spend more time on the feasibility of deep emission costs, new relative to what I did last year in the video that you could have watched, or the book you may have read, and then I'm going to talk about negative costs, and what I should have added here is that the reading material was about the distribution of these costs, right? So here we are in the series, third lecture out of 9 or 10, I don't know why it's skipped this. Next week we're going to talk about instruments for emission reduction, and then we're going to talk about why climate change is a problem, right? So we're sort of approaching the end of the bit on climate policy. So the first takeaway point is that the costs of greenhouse gas emission reduction are real and they're positive, that it costs money, and there are two or three ways of looking at this. Just intuitively, if there's no climate policy, then essentially you can dump your CO2 into the atmosphere for free. If there were a carbon tax, you would have to pay for that, right? Or if there's some sort of constraint, a standard on the technology that you're using, then what used to be free is no longer, what used to be unconstrained is no longer constrained. So necessarily this imposes a cost. Because you didn't like your CO2 emissions, or you didn't like your fuel mix, you could have changed that. If you didn't like the car that you drive, or the place that you live, you could have changed that, right? But you didn't. You choose to use this amount of energy and this type of energy, and therefore the CO2 that came with it. And now policy tells you to do things differently. That necessarily comes at a cost. So that is an intuitive way of looking at things. There's also a mathematical way of looking at things, obviously, and that is that climate policy essentially imposes an additional constraint on the economy. And what you know from the work of Laplace is that if you have an optimization system, if you have an optimization problem, and you impose on that optimization constraint, and that constraint bites, then necessarily your objective function, your welfare, goes down, right? So that is a mathematical way of looking at the same thing. And if the shadow price of the constraint were 0, then obviously your objective function did not decline, right? but then the constraint also doesn't matter, right? So I think this is relatively straightforward, but unfortunately it needs to be repeated because not everybody seems to believe that this is the case. So the next question you may have is, so what are these costs? So let's look at some cost estimates. I'm not going to expect you to fully read this table, let alone learn it by heart, right? So what you're looking at here is a whole bunch of estimates of the costs at the margin of climate policy. And there's two things you notice. One is that there's a whole bunch of models that have come up with estimates, and those estimates are different. And the second thing that you notice, there's actually a whole bunch of policies that may be considered that lead to different costs. And both of these things are visualized in these two graphs. So let's start with this one here. What you're looking at here are 4, 8, 13 different estimates of the same thing. Of the question, if we want to stabilize CO2 concentrations by the end of the century at 550 parts per million, and we want to do so at the lowest possible cost, what would that cost be at the margin in the year 2020, that is this year, but these model calculations were done about a decade ago. And the thing that you notice is the striking differences between models, right? That some models say this can be done for at a carbon tax of $1 per ton of CO2, no, per ton of carbon, sorry. And other models say, no, this is going to cost you 20 at the margin. Right? And that is a large range, right? That's a factor 20 difference, not for estimating different things, but for estimating the same thing, right? So there is an enormous uncertainty about this. I'm going to come to the structural reasons why models differ so greatly about this. But it is sobering, right? That for this thing that tops the political agenda time and again, and has done so for decades, they haven't got a clue what it's going to cost us. The second thing that you see displayed here is the question, what climate policy? And that is actually an important question. Some people go around and say climate policy will cost without fully specifying what they actually mean, right? And of course there's no such thing as climate policy. There are very specific targets that you can pick. So let's do that in the table as well as in the graph. If you move from left to right, you move to more stringent climate policy. And you see the implications here given in blue. If you go for 450, we're actually not quite at the Paris target, but just slightly above it. 550 is less stringent, that's 3.5 degrees of warming. 650, we may go up to 4 degrees of warming. So the lower target is a more stringent policy. And what you see is that costs escalate, and actually rapidly escalate. If you're aiming for 650, you can get away with a carbon tax, maybe $5 or $10 per ton of C. But if you're aiming for 450, then you need to have a carbon tax of $100 per ton of C or more in the year 2020 that we're now, right? So that is as you would expect. The more stringent the target, the harder you need to work, the more expensive it will be, right? And this is highly non-linear also at the margin. Second question is, what do you actually mean by a target in the year 2100? And in the blue scenario, the assumption is that we have a target in the year 2100 and we can approach it from above or below. We actually don't care if our concentrations exceed our target in the interim. Whereas in the red costs, which are additional to the blue, the target actually, if you have a target of 450 by the year 2100, then we actually mean that also in the year 2090 we want to be below that, and also in the year 2080 we want to be below that, so we want to approach our target from below. That is considerably more stringent, and particularly if we have a stringent target, that doubles the cost coming at the margin. Right? So that is a detail that matters. It's actually not a detail. Doubling your cost is not a detail in policy, right? The third thing that is displayed here is the green bits, and that is the question, who pays the carbon tax? So in the blue and the red scenarios, the carbon tax that is displayed on this axis is applied to everybody, to all greenhouse gas emissions from all sectors in all countries. In the green scenario, the assumption is, well, perhaps rich countries should go first and apply a carbon tax in the year 2020. And then middle income countries, India and China and Brazil and Russia, should apply a carbon tax in the year 2030. And then the poorest countries, Africa and bits of Asia and Latin America, should apply a carbon tax only in the year 2050. Come in. But the target remains the same, right? So if you have a collective target, but only a fraction of the people works towards that target, then obviously if the target is unchanged, those have to work harder, right? And that is what you see. Again, the carbon tax that is required more than doubles. So these details of climate policy matter and matter quite a lot. Now, to place things in context and to sort of anticipate what I'm going to talk about in a minute or 10, the current price of carbon in Europe is 25 euros per ton of CO2. Which is roughly equal to $100 per ton of C. So this is where we are in Europe, right? We are at around 100. That's the order of magnitude. So in order to get to 450, right, what we should have done is convince the rest of the world to adopt a carbon tax or a carbon price that is comparable to the one we currently pay in Europe. Now, obviously,
what is the 655 in reference to?
This is the CO2 concentration
Right.
at the end of the century.
Yeah, tax is on the left hand side.
That's the carbon tax that you need to apply.
So like the columns that are labelled.
Oh, this is estimates of the same thing of the 550 by different models. And this is just the average across models. So what we should have done in order to get sort of to the upper end, perhaps a bit higher, of the Paris targets, is we should have convinced the rest of the world to adopt a European type climate policy, or European stringency for their climate policy. We obviously failed there, right? India hasn't followed, China hasn't followed, Russia hasn't followed, Brazil hasn't followed, the USA hasn't followed. Right? The implication, of course, is that we need to work harder, right? That means that actually what we should have done, if we're still serious about the 450, is that the countries that do have a climate policy should have raised the ambition. And Europe hasn't, right? So we're well on course to miss our Paris targets, and not by a little bit. So that is just to place these numbers in context. Now, this table has the marginal costs. The table that you're looking at now has the total costs given in net present value, and these are measured in trillion dollars. And two things that you notice, right? So the numbers that you're looking at are, the highest number that you see is $80 trillion. The lowest number that you see is negative, minus 200 billion. And again, you see the enormous uncertainty for the same policy, different models. Some models say this is going to cost you 4 trillion. Other models say this is going to cost you 44 trillion, right? So that's a factor 10 difference again between model estimates. Now, first about the absolute value here, right? So you probably think that this 80 trillion is a large sum of money, and even this 2 trillion is a large sum of money, and compared to your bank account, it is, right? The richest person on the planet is Vladimir Putin. He is worth around $200 billion. And here talking about an order of magnitude larger, 2 trillion, right? Or 2,000 billion. So even for Vladimir Putin, this seems to be a large sum of money, right? But it is actually not, right? Because the total value added in the world is around $80 trillion, and that is for this year, right? Whereas here we're looking at the net present value of the cost over the century. So if we take the net present value of the world economy, we expect that the world economy grows by 3% per year, we discount it at 5% per year. Those are the numbers you want to plug in. Then the net present value of the world economy is around 3,500 trillion, right? So if we pick this number here, the 35 trillion, that's 1%, right, of the world economy. So this is not a large number. It just seems large because the world is a large place, right? But it's in fact not a very large number. And that is an important thing to keep in mind, that it's actually cheap to decarbonize the economy. The reasons for that go back to what I told you last week, right, about the relative costs of renewables to fossil fuels. If you can make electricity by burning coal at 4 pence a kilowatt hour, to make electricity by burning gas at 6 pence per kilowatt hour, you can do it the same thing with solar for perhaps 9 or 10 pence. You can do it with wind for perhaps 6 or 7 pence. And what you're going to do with your climate policy is, if you were to fully decarbonize now, is essentially you're going to make electricity 20, 30, 50% more expensive. That's not going to tank the economy, right? The average household pays in the order of magnitude of a few thousand pounds per household per year towards their energy costs. So yes, it's going to hurt if that's going to be 50% more expensive, but it's not going to bankrupt people, right? and we don't have to do it this year, right? We kind of spread the cost out over decades. The cost of renewables are coming down and coming down and coming down all the time. So this is not going to cost the world. It's simply not possible if you have a smart policy. You do this gradually to tank the economy. Another way of looking at this is that the energy costs, the cost basis as an input to the economy, are 2 or 3% of the world economy. So even if you were to double the cost of energy, this is not what we're going to do, and that simply cannot cause major economic problems, right? And that is why these numbers are relatively low. And another way of phrasing this is to say that if we have a sensible and gradual climate policy, then the income we would reach on the 1st of January 2100 without climate policy, with climate policy we would reach perhaps on the 1st of June or the 1st of July of 2100, right? So we postpone economic growth over a century by perhaps half a year, right? So it is cheap. Now that all models agree on that it's cheap, but at the same time, in the total cost, we see a difference in estimates of a factor 10. In the marginal cost, we saw a difference in a factor of a factor 20. And the question is, why do models disagree so strongly? And here are 5 reasons. And the way to think about this is that you want to estimate what would this cost, so you build a model of the economy with great detail in the energy sector, because that's where most of the emissions come from, and perhaps great detail in the agricultural sector, because that's where the rest of the emissions come from. And models are always imperfect representations of the real world. And different models have different imperfections in their representation of the real world buildings. And if we compare these models systematically, what we find is that there's fewer options to reduce emissions, then the cost of greenhouse gas emission reduction will be higher. So some models assume that you can expand hydropower, and other models say, well, there's actually societal and political limits on how fast you can expand, or whether you can expand hydropower at all, whether that would be stopped by people protesting. And obviously, if you lose that option, it's going to be more expensive. Some models assume that it is relatively easy to electrify transport. Yeah, people will happily switch to electric vehicles. Other models assume, well, those things are good for driving in cities as a second car, but they're actually not at all useful as the prime family car, right? So depending on the assumptions that you make about the availability of a particular technology, you get higher or lower costs of emission reduction. The second reason why models differ in their cost estimates is what do they actually assume about the relative cost of renewables, particularly to fossil fuels. And you may think, like, why would you disagree on this? We actually don't know. I mean, a lot of this is done by commercial companies, and how much they really pay for their fuels is a commercial secret. There's all sorts of contracts going on between the users of electricity, or the generators of electricity, and the fuels that they buy, particularly in the UK market. Those contracts are simply not known to us. They're obviously known to the parties of the contract, but they're not known to academics like me. They're not known to the Office of National Statistics. let's take a stab at what renewables really cost and what coal really costs and what gas really costs, but we don't know these things for certain, and different modelers have made different assumptions about this. And this is of course far more pronounced because we're not so much worried about what would the cost of emission reduction be and what would the relative price of renewables versus fossil fuels be in the year 2020. But we're actually interested in what would these prices be in 2030 and 2040 and 2050, right? And then you are talking about price projections decades into the future, and that is not something that we are particularly good at, but it greatly drives the results, right? Models also differ in terms of what they assume about price elasticities and substitution elasticities. So essentially what a carbon tax does is it makes fossil fuels more expensive relative to renewables. And what that implies for the change in the energy mix depends on what you assume your price elasticity should be, right? And what your substitution elasticity are. Unfortunately, again, we don't have particularly precise estimates of price elasticities. This is not something that we teach anymore to economists, how to estimate the price elasticity. This is something that economists were terribly excited about between 1930 and 1970, roughly. And then all the sort of econometric details were sorted out, and then as a profession, we thought that estimating price elasticities is no longer that exciting anymore. So as a profession, we essentially gave up on estimating price elasticities. And it's just not interesting anymore, and therefore it's not typically done that often, and therefore we don't have particularly precise estimates of these things. Sort of tied into this is the question of the capital stock and the speed of the capital stock turnover. So if you take the University of Sussex and you're worried about our heating costs or the amount of CO2 we need to emit, the amount of CO2 we emit in order to heat these buildings during winter, and essentially that is set in stone, right? So if the price of energy goes up, then we can just bear and grin it, right? We can just pay for it, or we could try and use less energy. Now this is actually a relatively energy efficient building. Relatively, it's probably the best on campus in that sense, but it's not particularly good in terms of energy efficiency. Right? The doors are always open, the windows can't close. If you go to the offices, you actually see that the best way of keeping your building, keeping your office cool in winter when they turn up the heating to keep it warm below, you also kind of heat up the offices above. Winter time, I often have to open my window in order to have a tolerable temperature, right? So the best way of keeping my office cool is to just vent the extra heat into the atmosphere, right? Now the way to change that is essentially to rip out the circulation and heating system in this building and replace it, right? Which is expensive. This is a relatively good building. You can take Bramber with its awful windows. The best way to reduce the energy use in a building like Bramber is to just tear down the building and build a new one, right? This is completely awful. And the same goes for many of the buildings on campus. So if you radically want to reduce emissions from a site like this, essentially you have to make assumptions about how long will these buildings last and when will they be replaced by buildings that are built to higher standards. It's hard, right? We're getting a better grip on what is the expected lifetime of commercial buildings, right, 20, 30 years. And residential buildings in the public sector, becomes very, very difficult to come up with credible estimates of how long these buildings are going to last, right? So that matters, obviously. And then the final thing that is listed here, actually listed as point 4 rather than the last thing, is if everything depends on how relative prices are in the future, and therefore the assumptions that we make about relative prices in the future, do we actually assume that those relative price changes are something that just happen, or are they things that respond to climate policy? And I'm going to talk again about that next week. Some models assume that if we now make fossil fuels more expensive, then in response people are not only going to invest more in renewables, but they're also going to invest more in R&D into renewables, into making renewables better and cheaper. And if that is what you assume in your model, then the price path becomes endogenous, essentially, and by doing a climate policy now, you're going to buy cheaper climate policy in the future. And if that is the assumption that you make, then climate policy is fairly cheap, right? Because you can buy it, you can invest in it to make it cheaper. Other models assume that that is not how the world works. Other models assume that, may actually assume the opposite. That if you're going to make fossil fuels expensive now, then yes, the response of research companies doing R&D, perhaps universities doing pre-competitive R&D, is to move more and more towards making renewables cheaper, and that will cut the costs of emission reduction, no doubt, but at the same time there's an opportunity cost to this. Because if all the smart people in the world are working to make renewables better, they are no longer working on making phones better, or computers better, or they're no longer working on curing cancer, or coronavirus, and that sort of stuff. And if you include that opportunity cost, then climate policy actually becomes a lot more expensive if you include this type of responsibility. Now, you may think that is a bit of an exaggeration, what I just said, but then also a few minutes before I told you that energy is around 2% of the economy on a cost basis. So if you're going to take away R&D from the rest of the economy to make the 2% of the economy better, and you have a finite supply of smart people on the planet, then a slight slowdown in the other 98% of the economy is of course going to cost you a lot, right? If you switch R&D, technological progress from the 98% to the 2%, that has a large implication for economic growth, right? And I mean, different people would reasonably disagree on all these, right? And probably if you think about it, you just would disagree with yourself, right? It can go this way, it can go that way. So that is why people strongly disagree on what it would cost to reduce emissions, right? By a factor of 10 in total, by a factor of 20 at the margin. Now the other thing you've noticed about this table is that there's many empty cells. And you may have put this to, these are just people being lazy, right? They just didn't feel like running these particular scenarios. If we put these things in a graph, then this happens, right? So what you're looking at here is the change in CO2 emissions relative to the year 2000, right? Where here we're going to see decarbonizing. 0 means we're heavy decarbonizing. No. 0 means we're stabilizing. 100% means we are fully decarbonized, right? That's how we use it. And then on the horizontal axis, we're looking at the scenarios I was just talking about. What is our eventual target? Do we approach it from below or from above? Who is participating? And essentially, we move from not so stringent climate policy to very stringent climate policy on this graph. And what you see is obviously the more stringent climate policy, the harder we need to work, reducing emissions. But you also see that more and more models, and the different colors are different models, do not report, right? So the empty cells that you see in the table are not random, so it's not laziness that would explain this, but they are systematic, right? The more stringent the target, the less likely it is that a particular modeling team would report results. And the reason for this is that when this exercise was done, people argued that these particular targets are infeasible. Their infeasibility could mean four things. Some models argued that it is physically impossible. In order to get to these very stringent targets for climate policy, you would need to violate the laws of physics. That's one reason that people said it could not be done. Other models reported that it's technically infeasible, that we simply do not have enough renewables to get there. Other models imposed political constraints on this. And I talked a little bit about, this is the one I want to do. I talked a little bit about, this is sort of where Europe is now, right? And in order to get to this target, we need to raise the taxes quite substantially. And perhaps there are reasons why no politicians would ever do this. And what we saw last year was President Macron in France trying to impose a carbon tax, and which essentially led to riots on the street, right? The whole Yellow Vest protest started against a carbon tax. So if your model includes such a thing as political constraints on what your carbon tax may be, then you may not be able to meet the very stringent targets, right? I should look at this one because this is the graph that you see. And the fourth reason why people would not report this is because the model may be able to solve it, but they think that the results are so ridiculous that they would not want to put their name on it, right? So that is the fourth reason why there are so many non-reports here. Now this is a slightly older result. Things have moved on. And this particular illustration is intriguing, right? So what we're doing here is relax immediate emission reduction. So the aim is to go for the low end of the Paris targets in the year 2100, that's 1.5 degrees, and then you can work out, there it comes again, and then you can work out how much CO2 can we emit. This is how much CO2 we have emitted, there's nothing you can do about that. And then different paths of emission reduction are shown. And if we want to go down, some people would call this gently, right? But actually, we're drawing down CO2 emissions twice as fast as they have grown in the past, right? So I would not call this gently. But then the price that you pay is that you need to go to below zero, sometimes around the middle of the century. So you can either have strictly positive emissions everywhere, but then you need to draw down emissions like to make bread that loss, right? As fast as they're coming down. But then you can go to a more gentle drawdown if you have net negative emissions in the long run. Now the question is, what are those net negative energy emissions? So this is essentially a repeat of last week, right? So CO2 comes from burning fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are just ancient biomass, and if you do that, you emit CO2, right? That's how you get the energy out. What you can also do is, rather than venting that CO2 into the atmosphere, you can put a scrubber on your smokestack, take the CO2 out of the flue gas and store it someplace. That's carbon capture and storage. This is a proven technology, right? The bubbles in your beer are CO2, which means that we know how to take CO2 out of the gas, right? And store it as CO2, pure CO2, right? That's proven technology. Of course, if the bubbles in your beer are CO2, they're bubbling, right? So they're being vented into the atmosphere, just with a bit of delay, right? But we know how to capture CO2. It's a proven technology. We also know how to transport CO2, right? How would otherwise that CO2 have gotten into your beer? And we actually also know how to store CO2. Because CO2 is used to increase the pressure in aging oil fields. So if you're pumping oil, and in the beginning it's easy, right? You must have seen gushers at some point in your life where if you just hit the oil well for the first time, the oil just comes gushing out, right? That's because there's a lot of pressure built up there. But after a while, you've taken the oil out and therefore reduced the pressure, and it doesn't come gushing out. You actually need to start pumping. And so what they do is they take something that is relatively cheap and relatively easy to get there. They take CO2 and pump it into the oil fields to increase the pressure so that the oil comes out, right? And then it typically stays there, the CO2. So we know how to capture CO2, we know how to transport CO2, we know how to store CO2. Go ahead.
So ultimately, it's CO2 stored in the wood, or is that artificial?
That depends on the particular geological structure. But if you do this in an ancient gas field, and obviously the natural gas has been there for a very long time. So if you take the gas out and put CO2 in, the chances are that the CO2 will stay there for a very long time, right? We're talking tens of millions of years. If you pump CO2 into any old cave, no, then not, right? Then it can leak, sometimes very rapidly, sometimes very slowly. So it just depends on the geological circumstances, right? Okay, if you do this, right, you no longer emit the CO2. You take the gas out of the ground, you burn it, you take the CO2, before it enters into the atmosphere, and you stick it into the old gas field. And as a result, you have zero carbon fossil fuels. Comes at a cost, right? Capture plant on a power plant adds about 25% of your capital cost. So you can build a gas plant for £100 million. If you want to put a capture plant on it, then you're going to pay £125 million for that plant, right? And capturing CO2 takes energy. Around 30% of your electricity output no longer goes to the grid, but goes to your capture plant, right? So you have a 25% increase in your cost and a 30% reduction in your output. So this is expensive, right? And then you just have the CO2, but you have to transport it and store it in a safe place, right? So it can be done, proven technology, but expensive, right? But zero CO2 fossil fuels, roughly. Another thing that you can do in order to make electricity without emitting CO2 is to not use ancient biomass, but to use fresh biomass. You can grow trees, chop them up, and put them into a coal-fired power plant. Or you can gasify those trees and put them into a gas-fired power plant. That's also zero CO2 because those plants have just grown and sucked CO2 out of the atmosphere. Right? So essentially the idea here is that you let the tree suck CO2 out of the atmosphere, then you chop up the tree, you burn it, and you emit the same amount of CO2 again by and large, right? So this is also zero carbon. But now if you combine those two ideas, you have negative carbon energy, right? You generate electricity while sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere as the plants grow, and then make sure that it doesn't get emitted, but it's captured and stored, right? So that is where the negative emissions come from in this one. And here we go again. So technically this is feasible. There are issues with scale. Because you would need to do this at a massive scale, absolutely massive. People have reckoned that if you really want to do this, then you would need to plant an area the size of India with biomass fuels. That's a big place. That's very, very big, right? People have also reckoned if this is the amount of CO2 you want to capture and transport and store, the transport infrastructure that you need is 5 times the infrastructure that we currently use for oil and gas. That's a lot of concrete and a lot of steel. Why is it so much larger? Because CO2 is less dense than natural gas. So simply, if you compare a methane pipeline to a CO2 pipeline, there's simply 5 times as little in the same pipeline, right? So in terms of scale, this is absolutely ginormous. What does it mean in terms of cost? 4 graphs here. What you're looking at here are a bunch of results from the latest report on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. 6 different targets. Brown is very lenient climate. Dark green is very stringent climate policy. The emissions here are measured in billion metric tons of carbon dioxide. We start in the year 2010 is, and move into the future, and what you see, to go for the very stringent targets, you need to go to net negative emissions, right? The central lines are the average across models. The dotted lines are the range across models. The carbon tax that you would need to impose to get here obviously depends on the stringency of the climate policy. If you go for the least stringent one, then the carbon tax goes up to, what is it? I actually don't know what it is. But for the very stringent climate policies, it goes to way above. It goes to 2,000 or more. That's a model average, but some models say no, it goes up to $8,000. Right? Current price is around 100 So that is the marginal cost. This is the total cost that we're looking at. Again, I've given you this message, right? If you go for a lenient climate policy, then you would be a percent or so poorer in a century's time, right? Knowing that the economy grows at 2% or per capita income grows at 2% a year. In 100 years' time, you would give up half a year of economic growth. But a more stringent policies is still relatively cheap, right? You can go to 5% loss of income. The most pessimistic model says we're going to cut 20% of income. Still, after a century of economic growth, losing 20% of that would still make you considerably better off. The main issue, I believe, is negative carbon energy is shown in this particular picture here, where we're looking at the carbon tax revenue relative to the size of the economy. And in most of these scenarios, the dark brown, the light green, you see that this is somewhere around 0. But if you go to the most stringent climate policy, where we have very substantial negative emissions, carbon tax on an emission is revenue for the government, right? A carbon tax on a negative emission is a subsidy, right? It's money that flows from the government to the people who are sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. That, according to the model, average goes up to 4% of GDP. That's roughly twice what we pay for the military, roughly half what we pay for healthcare. That's a large sum of money, right? That's a very substantial subsidy. And the question then becomes, what does this subsidy go to? Who gets this subsidy, right? So I explained negative carbon energy to you. There's a lot of biomass involved, right? The cheap way of growing biomass is large-scale plantations by multinationals, right? That's how you keep it cheap. And then you also need to pay utilities to make sure that the scrubber plants are built and turned on. And then you need to pay other multinationals to store the CO2 safely. So whereas we're currently paying taxes to provide money to the NHS, that money goes to something that is tangible, right? I sincerely hope that you have had very little interaction with the NHS, but you can definitely imagine being ill and then you're happy that there's a hospital. I'll come to you in a second. You probably know people who are nurses and doctors. You probably know the local hospital, right? That is, yes, your tax money goes to your friendly neighborhood nurse, right? And you can definitely see a value in their work. This money would go to multinational companies, right? It's very hard to imagine anybody voting for 10-12% of their taxes to go to multinational companies. So I just don't see this happening. You've been patient.
Is that assuming like a constant tax policy throughout the century?
No. This is the carbon tax. So it gradually or rapidly ramps up.
Is not assuming by say 2090 that companies will also implement other ways to reduce their carbon footprint, so it's always less.
No, I mean, these are fully dynamic models, right? So, yes, all the wind power is in there and all the solar power is in there and there's an expansion of nuclear and so on and so forth. It's just not enough to get to the very stringent climate policies. The only way to get there, and that is I should have said this. One of the reasons that people said in earlier assessment that it was technically not possible to get to the very stringent targets is because they assumed that net negative carbon would never exist. And it's only after people started allowing for negative carbon energy that the models went to the the negative emissions that you see displayed here, right?
If you were to have like, so if you have negative carbon emissions and carbon tax, that's actually a substitute.
Yeah.
Is that sort of similar over the last module groups as well, like China or various countries that have like they're saying we want to build a fossil fuel power plant, and then another country goes, I will pay you not to build it, we pay you not to do a producing activity. Is that sort of a similar idea?
Yeah.
And does it work though? Like you said in that if you were like, there's got to go over just being game of like people just saying, you know, you wouldn't feel going to build it, you know, you're definitely going to build it and then you pay us lots of money.
Well, presumably there would be a contract there that only pays out if they're really operating their plants, right? So that I don't think is a major concern, because I mean we are talking about very substantial infrastructure, so it's easy to see and check that it's there. There are issues with the permanence of CO2 storage, as you rightly noticed, that it stay there forever. And obviously the company will say, yes, it will stay there for at least 10,000 years. But there are issues there with if you stick CO2 in the ground, what would really happen, right? Because it is not something that we have done on a massive scale. So there are issues with permanence, but that would be the main thing. The carbon capture plant is something you can observe. You can also observe that it's there, but also that it's used. Is more about what will it cost to reduce emissions. And what you're looking at here is an even older study where different models, in this case there's only 6 we made, looked at the cost differences between scenarios that led to the same eventual concentration, 455, 56, 57, 50, and there's 2 scenarios that you see. One is the light blue, where you very rapidly deviate from a no climate policy scenario, and in the black, the dashed line, you deviate later from the no climate policy scenario. These are concentrations here, the same thing for emissions, where you see the contrast highlighted, that you stay on the business as usual, the no climate policy scenario, then you deviate, versus this one here, where you start deviating immediately. Of course, if you work harder in the beginning, you don't have to work so hard later on, right? So, and you can see here that actually leads to the same climate change in the very long run, right? And then the question is, which of the 2 scenarios, which of the 2 approaches is cheaper? So start ambitiously and accelerate not so ambitiously, versus start gradually and accelerate rapidly over time. And the answer, how much would it cost, is shown by comparing the first to the third scenario, or the second to the fourth. And what you see in this particular model, if you start slowly and then accelerate, that is this one here, you roughly half the costs. Same is true, actually it's costs are only 20% or so, 5% perhaps, and only exception here is where you save perhaps 10% of the cost, maybe 20%. Still, we're talking about trillions of dollars, so saving 10% on a trillion is something that we should consider, right? And the question then is, of course, why? Right? Why is it cheaper to start slow and accelerate than to start with a big bang? And there's 4 reasons for this. and I've mentioned two of them already. One is capital stock turnover. In the short term, emissions are set in stone essentially. So if you start with a high carbon tax, you're essentially punishing people for decisions they made in the past and they can't do anything about it in the short run anyway. So you're just punishing the economy without much emission reduction. But if you start gradually, you work with a capital stock turnover, you replace things when they near the end of their economic lifetime, you have much lower costs. Second reason I mentioned already as well, and that is that what we've seen in the past is that the cost of renewables relative to fossil fuels have fallen quite substantially, and we expect this to continue, which implies that future emission reduction is cheaper than current emission reduction. The third reason is discount rates. Costs that you incur later in time are less important than costs that you incur now. So that is a reason to work harder later. And the fourth reason is the carbon cycle. If you're interested in what emissions or concentrations would be in the year 2100 or in the year 2200, you built a carbon cycle model by now, or you at least looked at a carbon cycle model by now. CO2 degrades from the atmosphere. So if you're concerned about concentrations in the year 2100, then emissions in the year 2090 are more important for the concentration in the year 2100 than emissions in the year 2020. But you can also turn that on its head. And emission reductions in the year 2090 have a greater effect on the concentration in the year 2100 than emission reductions in the year 2020. This is not just that your emissions are degraded, but also, by the same token, your emission reductions are degraded from the atmosphere. Right? So that is essentially acts as a discount rate as well. And I gave you last term, I actually showed some equations that had exactly the same result. So these are the reasons why an optimal climate policy starts slow and then accelerates. Now, I started by saying that it costs money to reduce emissions. And I also said that apparently this has to be repeated because there are many people out there who say that this is a win-win, we can reduce emissions and save money at the same time. Most of these claims are bogus. The most profound mistake, and the most common mistake, is a confusion between market forces and policy. So last week I showed you this particular graph where energy intensity has been cut in half over a 45-year period, and I argued this is because energy is a cost to the economy and therefore people work hard to minimize energy use, right? And this trend has been going on for as long as we know. There are people out there who forget about this and think that any energy efficiency improvement is because of their brilliance or their policy intervention. And engineers very commonly make this mistake that if you assume frozen technology, you assume that energy intensity does not improve, and then you come up with some sort of thing that improves energy intensity, that makes machines more energy efficient and therefore makes people want to buy these things. And because they want to buy things, they do so voluntarily, so this must be improving their welfare. They somehow think that this is because of policy intervention. No, it's just how the market works, right? The most prominent, perhaps, example of this is the president before last of the United States, George W. Bush, Bush the Younger, who at one point announced a climate policy, and his major climate policy initiative would be to improve energy intensity, and would be to improve energy efficiency by 14% over a decade, forgetting that in the previous decades energy efficiency had improved by 18% per decade. He actually thought that these things hadn't happened, and the promise he made was actually to slow down technological progress rather than accelerate it. So that is one common confusion of politicians and engineers. Another confusion that you see in engineering models is that people assume the wrong discount rate. So a lot of these technologies to reduce energy use are investments that you make now and earn back later. So if you insulate your house, you have an expenditure now, and as a result, you have lower costs of running your household later, right? So it's an investment with a later payoff, so the trade-off is a good idea, yes or no, it depends on the discount rate you assume. For some reason, engineers got it into their heads that households can borrow money at the same rate as the government can. And it doesn't matter how often they are told that this is not true. I've told many of my colleagues, just go to the bank and try to borrow money at this rate that you assume, and see whether you're laughed out of the office. And they keep on assuming this. And of course, if you assume a low discount rate, then any investment that has substantial upfront costs but lower payments later seems like a good idea. But if you include the actual rate of borrowing, then of course it's a different matter, right? You guys borrow at 6%, right, from the government? 6 points, a bit more actually, right? JV borrows money at 1%, right? So if you assume that you could borrow money at 1%, but go to the bank and say, the Chancellor of the Exchequer borrows money at 1%, can I have a loan at 1% please? See how the bank manager responds, right? It simply doesn't happen at all. The third thing that is a bit more subtle is that there's often hidden costs. And I talked about heating systems, right? So suppose you actually own your place, the boiler breaks down and you want to replace it. And you call in some suppliers. They can sell you the newest, fanciest, most energy efficient model, right? And that will be more expensive, but will save a lot of money later. Or you can just buy the one that is leading the market at the moment. And that will be less expensive, but you will have higher energy. So the discount rate matters. But also, there's hidden costs, right? You can just do the calculation based on the assumption that your boiler will always work. But it doesn't, right? And ours tend to break down just a day or so before Christmas. And then it gets very cold in the house and you need to call a repairman. And of course, there's a lot of machines breaking down just before Christmas. And it takes them a day or two to come and repair them. That is if you have the model that everybody else uses. Because then there's loads of repair people who can actually fix your boiler. If you go for the latest, fanciest model, then chances are if it breaks down, they need to fly in an engineer from Sweden. And it will take 6 weeks to repair the thing, right? And if you ignore these costs, ease of repair, reputation, ease of getting replacement parts, and so on and so forth, the fancy model looks a lot more attractive than it really is, right? Now these things are difficult to model and difficult to measure, but they do explain real household decisions. So most of these claims about you're going to make money while reducing emissions are just wrong. but there is a bit of economic theory, or actually more than a bit, that shows that there could be negative abatement costs. And the reason for this is an assumption that goes into many of the tools that have been used to estimate these costs that I showed you before. Most of these models are either optimization models or equilibrium models. And their starting point is that we're in an economic optimum. And if you're in an economic optimum, that's actually the second remark I made, and you impose an additional constraint, then you necessarily impose a cost, right? So the way to think about this is you're on a hill, you're at the top of a hill, you're in the optimum. It doesn't matter which direction you go, the only way is down, right? That is the top of the hill. If, however, your starting point is that you're not at the top of the hill, but you're somewhere on the side of the hill, if your starting point is the assumption that the economy is somehow imperfect, then of course, depending on if you're on the side of the hill, depending whether you go east or west or north or south, you may go up or down the hill, right? Similarly, if your starting point is an imperfect market and you impose a policy, then it all depends on the details of that policy and so on and so forth. So negative costs, reducing emissions while making money at the same time, may arise if climate policy reduces the imperfection in the market. For that I need to redo a little bit of fiscal policy. So the key part here is how distorted is the economy that you're trying to reduce emissions from. Fiscal economists would tell you three things. The first is that a tax is more distortionary if the price elasticity is higher. So what does this mean, right? So the starting point or the yardstick is an economy that is perfect. And then if you impose, say, a labor tax, you're distorting, you're changing the relative prices of labor versus capital. And that means that you move the economy away from where it would have been without this tax. And the measure of distortion is essentially how far do you move the economy away from where it would have been had there not been a tax, right? That is your measure of distortion. That's then typically measured some sort of welfare measure. Now obviously, if the price elasticity is higher, a tax that changes prices moves the economy further away from where it would have been, right? So the higher the price elasticity, the more distortionary the tax. So that is one thing. The second thing is that if the tax base is narrower, the distortion is greater. And you should see this relative. So relative, if you want to raise £1 million in tax revenue, and you raise that tax from basically everybody in the UK, then you distort their behavior only a tiny little bit. Whereas if you raise that same amount of tax from only 10 people, you're going to change their behavior by a lot, right? And if you assume that the reaction is nonlinear, the assumption here, then the narrower the tax base, the more distortionary a tax becomes. So those are two things that fiscal economists would agree on. Third thing is essentially a rule of thumb, and that is that the welfare loss, the deadweight loss of any tax, is roughly quadratic in the level of that tax. So now what would happen if you were to raise a carbon tax and use the money to reduce labor taxes? Would it increase or decrease the overall distortion? Well, price elasticity of energy is pretty low, right? But the price elasticity of labor is also low. The wage elasticity is also low. So that doesn't really matter. Tax base, well, about half of the population works. About 40% is subject to income taxes. So your tax base there is 40%. Everybody uses energy. So the tax base there is 100%. So a labor tax has a narrower tax base than a carbon tax, and therefore is more distortionary. So to shift the tax burden away from labor towards emissions, you actually decrease the overall distortionality of the fiscal system. And the third point here is that labor taxes are high at the moment and therefore cause a large debt rate loss, whereas carbon taxes are low at the moment and therefore cause a low debt rate loss. So if you increase the one that causes a high loss and decrease the one that causes a high loss and increase the one that causes a low loss, you have a net gain, right? Clear? So this seems like a reasonable idea, right? And there is one complication where some economists say this is a single thing that drives everything, and others say, well, perhaps not. All this goes under the double dividend literature. So the first dividend is that if you impose a carbon tax, you reduce emissions. The second dividend is that you change the structure of your fiscal system. You move from more distortionary to less distortionary taxes. That's the second dividend. But then some people say, or there is a third effect, and that's the tax interaction. And that is, if you put a carbon tax on, then you increase the price of energy. Everything we do or make uses energy, so everything becomes more expensive, right? It's not just that energy becomes more expensive, but everything becomes more expensive. We increase inflation. And if you increase inflation, then essentially you reduce the return to work, the wage, you reduce return to capital, and therefore you reduce the incentives to work and invest. And these effects at least partly offset your second dividend, right? Partly undo this. I know some economists who argue that this always completely offsets this. I don't buy that argument, but there are people who claim it. So there's all these things going on. Question is, how real is this? These are welfare variations, where positive is good, negative is bad, for a whole bunch of countries in Europe, and then also for the EU as a whole. This is an older work, so this is the EU 15. Back in the day there were 15 members of the EU, right? The UK was one of them. And then the different colors give you different measures of welfare, either mixing equivalent variation, the household consumption, or the change in GDP. And what you see is that depending on the country that you're looking at, but also varying with how stringent is your climate policy, you see a lot of positive effects on welfare, but also some negative effects. A lot of this is driven by a concern about unemployment, which is still a big issue on the continent, and was a bigger issue when this work was done. So the measure here is the change in employment. So if you reduce labor taxes, you make it more attractive to hire workers, right? For a bunch of European countries, for one single emission reduction scenario that I forget at the moment. And what you see is positive effects basically everywhere, but it really depends also on what you assume about the labor market, how that responds to price signals, both in the supply of labor and the demand for labor. But positive effects basically everywhere. And what you're looking at here is the same set of studies, the same set of models, but now different ways of using the tax revenue. And that I think is better explained and shown with this particular table. These are very old results, right? So people were talking about what would happen in the US to the US economy if in the year 2010, which was in the far future when this research was done, we imposed a carbon tax of $40 per ton of carbon. And we use the tax revenue in different ways. So there's 4 alternative representations of how the US economy works, it's expected to work, and then there's 9 different ways of using the tax revenue. And the first may come to you as a surprise, is essentially a lump sum transfer, which is sending everybody a check in the post, which is what the US government sometimes does, right? This is often used in economics papers as sort of like a yardstick, but this is what the US government occasionally does. And if that were the way to use the carbon tax revenue, then you see that the effects on the size of the economy are negative for every model. Can also use the money to increase government consumption. You see negative effects throughout. You can use the money to reduce income taxes, and then you see negative effects throughout. But in Europe, I showed positive effects throughout. So why is that? Actually, what happens in the US is that if you decrease profit taxes, you see 2 of the models showing positive effects. And if you use it to give tax credits for investment, you see positive effects throughout, right? So why is this? Well, in Europe, most of the tax burden is on people, and taxes on companies are actually pretty low. In the US, it is the opposite. Taxes on households are actually pretty low, but taxes on companies are pretty high. And the reason for that is that in the American democracy, it's people who vote, and in the European democracy, it's companies who vote? Don't know, right? But yeah, the US tax system is much more friendly towards people and much less friendly towards companies than the European system is. And that means that in the US, you would want a different fiscal reform than you would see in Europe, right? Now, that is an important thing to keep in mind, that this is not a one-size-fits-all, right? Fiscal reform requires that you actually understand the fiscal system that you're trying to reform. And also, actually, on some tax reforms, it really depends on how you think the economy works. And these are 4 respectable models with some Nobel laureates behind them and so on and so forth. These are very credible models, and they can't agree on the sign, right? So in order for this fiscal tax reform, or in order for this double dividend to work, right, that you can reduce emissions and make money at the same time, yes, it's theoretically possible, right? You cannot exclude that this is the case. But what you need is 2 things, right? You need politicians who are smart enough to understand what best to do with the tax revenue, and you need politicians who can resist the temptation to spend the money on other things, even though they would know better, right? And they could spend the money on the military, or they could spend the money on their lobbyists or on their friends, right? So theoretically, it's possible to reduce emissions and make money at the same time. In practice, it may be much more difficult, right? Okay, that was the lecture material. We have only 10 minutes left. So who read this particular paper? You did. And what does the paper do?
So it looks at the effects of carbon tax and looks at the distributional effect. So it mainly highlighted the issues with how to compensate people for losing out on the carbon, for the money that they lose out on carbon tax. And then it looks at the difficulties with people that maybe can't be compensated. And it looks at the best policies to compensate people.
Exactly. So far I've been talking about the average cost in the economy, right? But different people would be affected differently by a carbon tax. And it's important not to forget it, and that's why I put this particular paper on. I'm not promoting my own work here. There is on Canvas, there is a paper about the UK, but that goes back to 1994 using data from 1990. So I thought I'd do a paper about a very similar economy that is only 10 years old, right? So that's why this is here. Energy is a necessary good. If you increase the price of energy, you're gonna hit the poorest hardest, right? So that is shown in the first graph that comes. So this is how much people spend per week on energy for different types of energy. You see that particularly in terms of transport is where the main differences are between income deciles, right? You also see that poorest households spend perhaps €4 per week on energy. Richer households spend perhaps €5. But the richest are not 25% richer than the poorest, right? So, proportional to your income, this is regressive, right? And of course, that split is because motor fuels are so important. You also see a big split in city and countryside, right? Because in the city you can walk to work, you can cycle to work. There's buses, there's trams. The countryside, there is the car, right? So what does a carbon tax do? Oh wait, this is per household size. Yeah, it should not be forgotten, right? It's not just income, but it's also all sorts of other things that matter. So what does a carbon tax do? It increases the costs for everybody, right? That's sort of the black lines that you see here. And that just reflects how much people spend on energy per week, right? And that is given on this axis here. What do we see on this axis? Yeah. So this is the size of the tax. Carbon tax, what we see on this axis in pink and in green are the benefits people get, unemployment benefits, pensions, child benefit, and the taxes people pay. This is Ireland, so highly highly progressive taxation, direct taxation, not VAT and that sort of stuff. Now the poorest income, poorest 20%, since we pay no income taxes, and then it goes up fairly steeply to the highest, to the richest 10%, right? And of course the benefit system is highly skewed, not so highly skewed, is skewed towards the lower end, right? The important thing here, and that's crucial methods in this paper is the order of magnitude. So on the right axis, where you see the carbon tax, things are measured in euros per week. On the left-hand side, things are measured in hundreds of euros per week. And that is an important thing to keep in mind, right? And the same would be true for the UK, same would be true for basically any European or any OECD. Now the implication of this is, of course, that small tweaks in benefits and taxes can easily offset any carbon tax, right? And that is where Macron went wrong with his carbon tax that he wanted to introduce. It's a relatively low carbon tax, but he forgot to announce compensatory measures. Like, which are trivial, right? Small tweaks here offset anything here, right? And it's 2 orders of magnitude difference. That's the important thing, not where it's 600 or 500.
What is it? Sorry, the green bar there, that's the green bars of taxes, so taxes that they're paying, like just normal taxes.
Yes.
So the top 10% are paying €6 a week in tax.
It's on the left axis. They pay
Well,
six,
that's what they're paying.
600,
About that,
600 euros a week.
Right, so it's just carbon tax.
Yeah. So that is what the paper then does, right? It takes the carbon tax revenue and it plays around with different things. So the in green we're looking here at a worsening of your real income as a result of the carbon tax, all in absolute numbers, right? Maybe it's 3 to 4 euros a week. Now I need to read, is this per household, not per person. And then what if we use the money to do 2 things? One is to increase the tax credits, which is essentially the amount of income you can earn without paying any tax, which helps the middle income people and the higher income people, but not to a lesser extent. But then of course you also need to worry about those people who do not pay any tax at all, right? Who are not helped by an increase in tax credits. And benefits, unemployment benefits and old age benefits will also increase. And that is what you see in pink, benefits increase, and in red, tax credit increase. And by using, I believe, not even all of the carbon tax revenue, you can actually construct a fiscal tax reform that is Pareto improving. Well, that improves the lot of every income group, right? And then the paper continues and says, well, we can also mess with child benefit, we can mess with the tax rate, right, rather than the tax credit. Similar story there, there's actually options available to make this work for everybody. So 2 important lessons here, 3 important lessons. One is the income distributional effects are important, right? Don't forget about it. Second, you actually don't need to, you shouldn't forget about it, but you also shouldn't worry about it, because you actually have, if you implement the carbon tax, you actually have the revenue to offset the negative effect, or more than offset the negative. So that is the second important lesson. The third important lesson is never trust a politician. So this work was done in preparation for the introduction of a carbon tax in Ireland, right? That carbon tax was introduced, when the carbon tax was discussed, the government promised to have these counter effects, to reform tax credits and to reform benefits. And then they never did. Right? They just went back on their word. They never did it. At the time, this was a coalition government. The PVV had just been kicked out of Parliament, and Labour, who you think would care about these matters, but didn't. The Deputy Prime Minister, the Tournister, Joan Burton, lost her seat yesterday. So that was a good thing. So, third lesson, never trust a politician, no matter how hard they promise things. But you should take care of these things. You can take, you should care about these things, and you can take care about these things.